Chicago, 1930. A cold wind moved through the streets of the South Side as people slowly began gathering outside a neighborhood bank. Some had arrived before sunrise. Factory workers finishing long night shifts. Small shop owners clutching bank books in their hands. Mothers hoping to withdraw money for groceries. For years, this place had been trusted. Inside its vaults sat more than $1.5 million belonging to the community. Savings built $1 at a time. But on that morning, something was wrong. The doors never opened. At first, people assumed it was just a delay, a late manager, a small problem inside the building. But as the minutes passed, the crowd outside began to grow, and the whispers started. Something had happened to the bank. Inside that building was the life savings of thousands of families. Money earned through years of sacrifice and hard work. And suddenly, it was all locked away. The institution that once symbolized financial independence on Chicago's South Side had collapsed overnight. But here's the strange part. The real reason behind the collapse wasn't just the stock market crash. The story of Binga State Bank is far more complicated. It's a story about ambition, about opportunity, and about how an entire financial system can unravel when the foundation beneath it begins to crack. Because by the time the people waiting outside that bank realized what was happening, it was already too late. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The bank at the center of the storm was called Binga State Bank. For years, it had stood on Chicago's South Side as more than a place where people deposited money. It represented hope in a city where financial opportunity was often limited for Black families who had migrated north searching for better lives. Inside those walls were the savings of teachers, laborers, barbers, small shop owners, and church congregations. Every deposit carried a story. Every dollar placed in the bank represented hours of work, sacrifice, and the belief that the future could be more secure than the past. By the late 1920s, Binga State Bank had grown into one of the most important financial institutions in Black Chicago. At its peak, the bank held more than $1.5 million in deposits, a remarkable achievement during an era when access to capital was tightly controlled and opportunities were often limited by race and segregation. For many residents of the South Side, seeing a thriving Black-owned bank was proof that progress was possible, even in a system that rarely welcomed them. Behind the bank stood one man whose life story seemed almost impossible when measured against the realities of the early 20th century. His name was Jesse Binga. To the community, he was more than a businessman. He was a symbol of determination and ambition, a man who had managed to build wealth and influence in a city where barriers stood in front of nearly every opportunity. When people walked through the doors of Binga State Bank, they were not only trusting a financial institution, they were trusting Jesse Binga himself. His reputation carried weight across the South Side. He had invested in real estate, financed homes, and helped establish businesses that served the growing Black population of Chicago. But years later, historians and investigators would look back at the sudden collapse of Binga State Bank and ask a question that still lingers today. How did one of the most powerful financial institutions in Black Chicago collapse almost overnight? Was the bank simply another victim of the economic chaos that swept across America during the early years of the Great Depression? Or were deeper forces shaping its fate long before the doors failed to open that morning in 1930? To answer that question, we have to go back to the beginning of Jesse Binga's journey, long before the bank existed, to a time when the idea of a successful Black banker in Chicago seemed almost unimaginable. To understand how the doors of Binga State Bank could close so suddenly in 1930, you first have to understand the man who built it. Long before the bank held $1.5 million in deposits, before lines of anxious customers gathered outside its doors, Jesse Binga was simply a young man trying to build a life in a country where the path to success for Black Americans was narrow and uncertain. He was not born into wealth or privilege. Like many African Americans at the turn of the 20th century, his early opportunities were limited by a system that placed barriers in front of education, employment, and property ownership. Yet, Jesse Binga possessed something that would eventually change his life and the lives of many people around him. He had a remarkable instinct for business, particularly for real estate. When Binga arrived in Chicago, the city was expanding rapidly. Industries were growing, Railroads connected neighborhoods to factories and markets, and new housing developments appeared across the South Side. But even as the city grew, segregation shaped where Black residents could live and work. Many banks refused to lend money to Black families, and property opportunities were often restricted to a handful of crowded neighborhoods. Jesse Binga recognized something in that environment that others overlooked. He saw demand. He saw families arriving in Chicago looking for homes, stability, and a chance to build a future. Instead of waiting for opportunity to appear, he began creating it himself. Binga started small. He purchased modest properties in neighborhoods where Black families were settling. Sometimes the buildings needed repairs. Sometimes the transactions were risky. But Binga approached each investment with patience and careful calculation. House by house, block by block, he expanded his holdings. As the years passed, his confidence grew along with his reputation. Families who had struggled to find housing began renting from Binga's properties. Many of them saw him as more than just a landlord. They saw him as a businessman who understood the needs of the community. By the early 1920s, Jesse Binga had transformed himself into one of the most recognizable Black entrepreneurs in Chicago. His real estate investments had grown into a sizable portfolio, and his name carried weight throughout the South Side. Yet Binga understood that property alone would not be enough to change the economic future of the community he served. Housing created stability, but financial institutions created opportunity. Without access to banks, families could not easily secure loans to start businesses, buy homes, or expand their ambitions. And many traditional banks were unwilling to serve Black customers during that era. So Jesse Binga decided to build something that Chicago had rarely seen before. He founded Binga State Bank. The institution was designed to provide financial services to people who had often been ignored or rejected by larger banks. When Binga State Bank opened its doors, it quickly became more than just another business. For many residents of the South Side, it symbolized progress. Depositors walked inside carrying small savings and left believing that their money was protected by an institution that understood their struggles and their dreams. Churches opened accounts. Shop owners deposited their earnings. Families placed their savings in the vaults of a bank that felt connected to the community in a way few institutions ever had. Over time, the success of Binga State Bank mirrored the growth of the neighborhood around it. Deposits increased steadily. New accounts were opened every week. The bank financed homes, supported small businesses, and helped circulate money throughout the South Side economy. Jesse Binga's rise seemed to represent something larger than personal success. It represented the possibility that economic independence could be built even within a system that placed heavy limits on opportunity. And for a while, it appeared that Binga's vision was working. The bank grew stronger with each passing year, becoming one of the most significant financial institutions serving Black Chicago. But the same forces that helped create that success were also quietly shaping the risks that would one day threaten everything Jesse Binga had built. Between 1910 and 1930, a powerful movement began reshaping cities across the United States. It would later be known as the Great Migration. During these years, hundreds of thousands of African Americans left the rural South in search of opportunity in northern cities. Many were escaping discrimination and economic hardship, while others were drawn by the promise of factory jobs and better wages. Trains arrived daily carrying families who believed that somewhere beyond the South there was a chance to build a more stable future. One of the cities that attracted the largest number of these new arrivals was Chicago. As the trains pulled into the city, Chicago's Black population began to grow rapidly. Entire communities formed almost overnight on the South Side. Streets filled with new businesses, churches, barbershops, restaurants, and apartment buildings packed with families who had traveled hundreds of miles for a fresh start. But even as the population grew, segregation and housing restrictions meant that most Black residents were limited to a relatively small section of the city. Much of this growth concentrated in a neighborhood that would become widely known as Bronzeville. Within a few years, Bronzeville had developed into one of the most active Black communities in America. Right in the middle of this expanding neighborhood stood Binga State Bank. As more people settled in the area, the demand for financial services increased just as quickly. Workers needed a safe place to deposit their wages. Entrepreneurs needed loans to start small businesses. Churches needed institutions they could trust with their funds. Because many traditional banks refused to serve black customers during this time, Binga State Bank became one of the few institutions willing to provide those services. Deposits began to grow steadily. Each week, more families walked through the doors carrying their savings. Shop owners deposited their earnings. Local organizations trusted the bank with their accounts. Jesse Binga watched the institution he had founded become one of the financial centers of the South Side. The bank helped finance homes, support new businesses, and circulate money throughout the growing community. For a while, everything seemed to be moving in the right direction. The neighborhood was expanding, businesses were thriving, and the deposits inside Binga State Bank continued rising toward more than $1.5 million. To many people living on the South Side, the bank symbolized something powerful. It represented the possibility that economic independence could grow even within the limits imposed by segregation. But beneath that success, pressures were quietly building inside the financial system that supported the community. And when the American economy began to weaken at the end of the 1920s, those pressures would soon begin to surface. The success of Jesse Binga's growing financial empire rested heavily on one industry that had powered much of his rise: real estate. Long before Binga State Bank became a trusted institution on Chicago's South Side, Binga had built his reputation through property investments. He understood how housing demand was shaping the neighborhood, and he used that knowledge to finance homes, apartment buildings, and new developments throughout the community. When Binga State Bank opened its doors, much of its activity naturally followed the same pattern. Loans were issued to homeowners hoping to purchase their first houses. Property owners borrowed money to expand buildings or construct new ones. Developers looked to the bank for capital to keep the neighborhood growing. For years, this system appeared to work well for everyone involved. Because segregation limited where black families could live in Chicago, most new arrivals were forced to settle within the same concentrated area on the South Side. As the population increased, demand for housing rose quickly. Families competed for apartments, landlords expanded their buildings, and property values began climbing higher. Homes that had once been modest investments suddenly became valuable assets. This rising demand created the impression that real estate in these neighborhoods could only move in one direction: upward. And as those property values increased, the loans connected to them seemed secure. Borrowers could repay their debts. Banks could continue issuing credit. Businesses could expand. It looked like a cycle of growth that would continue for years. But the system had a fragile foundation. The success of many loans issued by Binga State Bank depended on one assumption: that property prices would continue rising. As long as homes remained valuable and landlords could collect rent, borrowers would be able to make their payments. Yet if property values ever began to fall, the entire structure could weaken quickly. Loans tied to those properties would become harder to repay. Buildings that once generated steady income might sit partially empty. And a bank that had invested heavily in real estate lending could suddenly face enormous pressure. During the late 1920s, few people on the South Side believed that kind of collapse was possible. The neighborhood was still growing. Businesses were active. Deposits inside Binga State Bank continued to increase, approaching the remarkable total of $1.5 million. To depositors, the bank looked stable and prosperous. Yet beyond Chicago, warning signs were beginning to appear within the national economy. Stock prices on Wall Street had climbed to extreme levels as investors poured money into the market. Banks across the country had extended credit at an extraordinary pace, and speculation had become a defining feature of the decade. Then, in October of 1929, something happened that shook the entire financial world. The American stock market collapsed, triggering a chain reaction that would soon reach far beyond Wall Street and into communities like the one that depended on Binga State Bank. In October of 1929, the American economy was shaken by an event that would change the country for years to come. On Wall Street, stock prices that had been rising throughout the decade suddenly collapsed. Panic spread across financial markets as investors rushed to sell their shares. The event would later become known as the Wall Street crash of 1929. What began as a crisis inside the stock market quickly spread into the broader economy. Businesses slowed down, companies began cutting jobs, and uncertainty replaced the confidence that had defined much of the 1920s. Banks across the country soon felt the pressure. As news of financial trouble spread, Many depositors grew nervous about the safety of their savings. In city after city, people hurried to their local banks to withdraw their money. Lines formed outside buildings that had once symbolized stability. Inside those banks, managers faced a difficult problem. Most financial institutions did not keep every dollar deposited inside their vaults. Much of that money had been loaned to businesses, homeowners, and property investors. When too many customers demanded their savings at the same time, banks could struggle to provide enough cash to satisfy everyone. At the same time, the weakening economy began affecting borrowers. Workers who lost jobs could no longer make payments on their homes. Businesses that depended on steady income suddenly faced declining sales. Property values, which had risen steadily during the previous decade, began to fall. For banks whose lending was closely tied to real estate, this shift created serious danger. Loans that had once appeared secure now carried uncertainty. Buildings that once generated steady rent sometimes stood partially empty, and each missed payment placed additional strain on the financial system. Binga State Bank was not immune to these forces. The institution Jesse Binga had built had grown alongside the real estate expansion of Chicago's South Side. Many of the loans issued by the bank were connected to homes and property developments within the community. As the national economy weakened after the stock market crash, those investments began facing new pressure. Borrowers struggled, property values softened, and confidence slowly began to fade. For a while, the changes were subtle. Daily life in the neighborhood continued. Workers still deposited their earnings, and businesses continued operating as they always had. But the financial strain spreading across the country was gradually reaching Chicago. And as rumors of banking trouble in other cities began circulating, the stability that once surrounded Binga State Bank started to feel less certain. It would not take much to turn that uncertainty into fear, and once that fear reached depositors on the South Side, events would move quickly in a direction no one in the community expected. As the economic pressure of the Great Depression slowly reached Chicago, rumors began circulating through neighborhoods on the South Side. At first, the whispers were quiet. People talked about banks in other cities that had suddenly failed. Stories moved through barbershops, churches, and crowded sidewalks. Some said certain banks were struggling to keep enough cash on hand. Others warned that if too many depositors rushed to withdraw their savings at the same time, even respected institutions could face trouble. Most people hoped those stories had nothing to do with Binga State Bank. For years, the bank had stood as one of the most trusted financial institutions in the community. Jesse Binga's reputation had helped build that trust, and many families believed their savings were secure. But once doubt enters a community during uncertain times, it spreads quickly. A few depositors visited Binga State Bank hoping to withdraw some money, just to be safe. Others followed after hearing neighbors had done the same. Within days, withdrawals increased. Each person standing in line believed they were simply protecting their family's future. Yet every withdrawal placed more pressure on the bank. Soon the line outside Binga State Bank stretched down the sidewalk. Workers held passbooks in their hands, waiting patiently for their turn. Some had saved for years. For many families, the money in those accounts represented everything they had managed to build. Inside the bank, the situation grew more difficult. Like most banks, Binga State Bank did not keep every dollar deposited inside its vault. Much of that money had been loaned to homeowners and businesses across the South Side. When too many depositors demanded their savings at once, the bank struggled to provide enough cash to satisfy everyone. What had begun as cautious withdrawals slowly turned into a wave of fear. Then one morning, people arrived expecting the bank to open as it always had. Instead, they found the doors closed. At first, the crowd waited quietly, assuming there had been a delay. Minutes passed, and the doors remained shut. More depositors arrived, only to see the growing crowd standing outside. Confusion spread across the sidewalk as the realization slowly set in. Binga State Bank had stopped operating. Depositors stood outside staring at the silent building that held their savings. Inside the vaults remained more than $1 million belonging to families across the community, but it was no longer accessible. When the doors of Binga State Bank failed to open, the consequences spread quickly across Chicago's South Side. For thousands of families, the closure was far more than the loss of a bank. It meant the sudden disappearance of savings that had taken years to build. Workers who had carefully deposited part of every paycheck suddenly faced the possibility that the money they depended on might never return. Some had been saving for a home. Others were setting money aside for their children's education or simply trying to protect their families during uncertain times. Overnight, that sense of security was shaken. The shock moved through the neighborhood quickly. Small business owners who relied on those deposits to buy supplies or pay employees suddenly faced serious financial pressure. Some shops were forced to close after losing the capital they needed to keep operating. Others struggled to survive, cutting back wherever they could while hoping the situation might improve. Churches and community organizations that had trusted Binga State Bank with their funds also found themselves in difficult positions, unsure how they would continue supporting the programs that many families relied on. Beyond the financial losses, the collapse damaged something even more important: trust. For years, Binga State Bank had represented stability and progress on Chicago's South Side. It had been one of the few banks willing to serve Black depositors during a time when many institutions refused. People believed their money was safe there. When the bank closed its doors, that belief was shaken. Residents began questioning whether any financial institution could truly protect their savings during such uncertain times. At the center of the crisis stood Jesse Binga. For decades, he had been known as one of the most successful Black businessmen in Chicago. His real estate investments and the creation of Binga State Bank had made him a respected figure throughout the community. But after the bank's collapse, attention quickly turned toward him. Investigations began examining the bank's records, searching for answers about what had gone wrong. Legal challenges followed, and Jesse Binga faced intense public scrutiny as people tried to understand how such a trusted institution had failed. Even today, historians still debate the deeper causes behind the fall of Binga State Bank. Some argue that the bank's strong connection to real estate left it vulnerable when property values declined during the Great Depression. Others believe that the economic crisis was so severe that even well-managed banks struggled to survive. Whatever the explanation, the collapse of Binga State Bank left a lasting mark on Chicago's South Side, reminding the community how quickly financial stability can disappear when confidence, economics, and trust collide. The story of Binga State Bank is more than the story of a single financial institution that closed its doors in Chicago. It is a story about ambition, determination, and the belief that economic independence could be built even during a time when opportunities were limited for many communities. Jesse Binga built his bank during an era when access to financial power was often restricted, and for years Binga State Bank stood as proof that progress was possible on the South Side. Families trusted it with their savings, businesses relied on it for growth, and the community looked to it as a symbol of stability and advancement. Yet the fall of Binga State Bank also reminds us how fragile financial systems can be. Even institutions built on trust and hope can struggle when economic pressures grow too strong. When confidence disappears and the foundations beneath a bank begin to weaken, the effects can reach far beyond balance sheets, touching the lives of entire communities. So what do you think really brought down Binga State Bank? Was its collapse simply the tragic result of the Great Depression sweeping across the United States after the crash of 1929, or were deeper economic forces already placing pressure on Jesse Binga's bank long before the doors failed to open that morning in Chicago? Some historians believe the bank was overwhelmed by the nationwide financial panic. Others argue that the economic conditions surrounding the South Side made institutions like Binga State Bank especially vulnerable when the crisis arrived. Even today, the debate continues. Now we want to hear from you. Do you believe the fall of Binga State Bank could have been avoided, or was it inevitable once the economic storm began? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoy uncovering powerful stories from financial history like this one, make sure to subscribe to the Dark Ledger so you never miss our next video, because the next story might be even more surprising than this one.